Warm weekend greetings from Spain. I'm honored and delighted to be with you virtually, taking part in MHYG Halliday's 100th Anniversary Memorial Symposium and the 4th Mittiessen Forum on Discourse Analysis, where I've been delighted to take part in person in the past. I've called my talk Meaning and Meandering with Michael, with the title MHYG, which stands for Mind How You Go, a Yorkshire sign-off Michael often used, and I used with him, essentially wishing everything best on the journey. In the programme, we're now on the first day, on the 12th, and I'm happily sandwiched between Kay and Winfred. Now, in the community around the world, people have had many different gateways into Michael Halliday's work on systemic functional linguistics, SFL in general, of course. Towards the applied end of the continuum of linguistics, applied linguistics, a great many people from richly varied disciplines and professions. Obviously, we think of education, we think of translation, we think of forensic work, we think on communication and healthcare, and many keep being added precisely because of the nature of Michael Halliday's SFL. And then there are others of us who've moved in through the gateway towards the theoretical end of the continuum. And that was my way in. I'll say a bit about that. But of course, there's a synthesis here, thanks to Michael Halliday's notion of applicable linguistics. So my theoretical way in involved his contribution solving two fundamental problems for me that emerged in my early studies of linguistics in the 1970s. Let me just name two of them and elaborate on each in turn. Decline of instantiation. So Michael Halliday's work on articulating the decline of instantiation, overcoming the dichotomy between langue and parole, or competence and performance, thus making a link between the domains of theory, the potential pole of decline, and the domain of data, the instance pole of decline, and allowing for intermediate patterns like register variation. And this is relevant both in qualitative and quantitative terms. He paved the way then for a theoretical interpretation of probabilistic linguistics that had a very clear foundation in observation of instances. And the second is what we've called the axial rethink, opting for a paradigmatic base in the organization of language as a resource. Let me pick up on the first, the decline of instantiation. So this is the continuum between the domain of theory and of data, as I said before, and it allows for intermediate patterns, including register variation, but also codal variation. And it allows us to perceive different time frames of semogenesis. See, for example, Halliday and Matthiessen, 1999, 2006, Construing Experience. Phylogenesis, ontogenesis, and logogenesis. And this, in fact, paves the way for a new approach to the study of in historical linguistics, something that is, you could say, embryonic in systemic functional linguistics, but could be developed in very exciting ways, relying precisely on the quantitative aspect of the connection between the potential and the instance, and also on the observation that languages change in terms of their registrial composition, their registrial makeup. An early study, long before SFL, that can now actually be interpreted in these terms is Alva Ellegord's study of what he called periphrastic do over a period of about 250 years. He ever displayed his observations in terms of the systems of polarity and mood type as simultaneous. So you see the intersection of declarative and positive, interrogative and positive, negative and declarative, and interrogative and negative. Let me magnify this a little bit. So from a period of around 1400 to 1700, you can see there is a little attempt or little tendency pre-Shakespeare to have do in positive declarative clauses, but that peters out. But in the other three mood and polarity environment, in positive interrogatives, in negative declaratives, and in negative interrogatives. There is a steady rise of do. So we can interpret the rise in relative frequency towards probabilistic certainty. And one of Michael Halliday's many contributions is precisely to problematize the notion of absolute versus very, very probable. And that is incidentally very important also in typological studies. So this work was done by Alvar Ellegård, and you can see the three combinations of mood type and polarity here, the change over a period of about 250 years. Now, as it happens, Ellegård's work about 2 decades later was also important in part of a puzzle that occurred to me was when I was reading linguistics early on in the mid-70s onwards. Ellegård wrote a contribution in Swedish to the understanding of what turned out to be actually generative semantics, transformationell svensk-engelsk satslära, transformational Swedish-English sentence structure. And I found that very insightful. I didn't realize at the time that this was not Chomsky's version of syntactic structures, aspects, model, and beyond, but Ellegård's attempt to apply generative semantics to an understanding of contrastive understanding of English and Swedish, foregrounding the semantic nature of syntax. So that was one tradition that he introduced into Sweden from abroad. An earlier generation, not but earlier linguist, my first professor of linguistics, Bertil Malmberg, was the person who introduced European structuralism into Sweden. And he wrote a book that appeared in several editions starting in the late 50s called Nya vägar inom språkvetenskap, New Ways Within Linguistics. That presented European structuralism with a sort of balance between the two axes, paradigmatic axis and syntagmatic axis, and that seemed tremendously insightful to me. But I have no way of combining these two, so that was my puzzle in the mid-70s. Then I came across Michael Halliday's contributions. They started in 1966, of course, his paradigmatic orientation as deep syntax, deep grammar, then onwards in the 70s. And I realized that there was a connection. And the connection is, of course, due to Halliday making the paradigmatic axis the basis of order in the representation order of language, in language. And that is because he conceived of language as a potential, as a meaning potential. And the way you represent that in systemic theory is by means of system networks with realization statements. And in one fell swoop, then he'd connected the paradigmatic axis and the syntagmatic axis for me. And it's difficult to convey now, all those decades later, what a tremendous aha-erlebnis this was. A kind of bolt of lightning providing a new insight. For me, that is one of his fundamental contributions, of course, to SFL, but also to linguistics in general in the 20th century, with a trajectory into the 21st century. And I could see how this worked out in various publications from the 70s, including, of course, his 76 book, edited by his long-term friend and student Gunter Kress. This led into all the work in the 80s and the 90s on systemic functional descriptions of English, of course, organized around the system, around the meaning potential as it is manifested as a wording potential, a potential for constructing meanings as wordings. It appeared in my own lexicogrammatical cartography. And when Michael Halliday invited me in to work on the third edition of his Introduction to Functional Grammar, one of the first things he said to me, let's introduce system networks. So that followed about 9 years after I tried to organize a description of the lexicogram of English around system networks. Now this is, as I said, what we've called the axial rethink. And if you follow that through, as I've done in various publications, you see how that actual rethink actually leads to a number of new insights into language, like the metafunctional clustering that Halliday began to find in the early 1960s and explain through his history of metafunction, like his ability to integrate intonation by describing it systemically, like his insight that grammar and lexis form a continuum, they're not separate components or modules of books. Like, in fact, the Kleiner instantiation that I mentioned, and a number of other insights, including his work on the Genesis. Now, if you try to place his work in the linguistics of the 19th and 20th century, we just keep a couple of notes, and this is in part in relation to a manuscript that remains for me to complete, Outline of Systemic Functional Linguistics in 2 volumes, that includes a historical survey. Now, as we all know, the 19th century linguistics was focused on diachronic view, very much the zeitgeist of the Romantic period and the age of evolutionary thinking, largely within the sound system of language, phonology, sound laws, little bit within lexis, morphology. In the 20th century, in contrast, you can interpret in a very broad sweep the development of linguistics as a gradual ascent along the hierarchy of stratification, phonology into morphology, then syntax and semantics, and then text, partly as a sideways steps. Now, since the 1950s, many linguists or historians of linguistics have characterized this period in the 20th century as the age of syntax. One among many contributions is by Giorgio Graffi, and he says the amount and variety of linguistic research development enormously in the second half of the 20th century, called the second half of the same century the age of syntax, the age of syntactic theories. And of course, SFL contributed, through Michael Halliday and others, SFG, Systemic Functional Grammar. But if you take a step back, or several steps back, you see that SFG is only, in fact, a small part of SFL. So importantly, the age of syntax, yes, in many linguistic traditions in general, but in SFL it was the age of language and context, and that we can now see as holistic theory and comprehensive descriptions. And Michael Halliday, among other systemic functional linguists working with him and following him, emphasized this in many contexts. And you can say one emblematic question he asked is, how big is language? So it's very much a question having to do with holistic thinking, but language in general, modern language as opposed to archaic language, and having to do with comprehensive descriptions. I've talked about this on various occasions. This is the celebrations of his 90th birthday, 2015, in Sydney. And I talked about it again just a few weeks ago in India, and somebody snapped a photo of me. So we now have a sort of fractal of this representation of the question, how big is language? And so you can see Michael Halliday's work that there are various representations where he attempts to provide a chart or a map that allows us to reason about the size of language and to reason about language systemically. So we can relate this to general systems theory. So among many other contributions, you have the instantiation stratification matrix. If we locate Michael Halliday in generational waves of linguistics, we can say, right, well, he was born a quarter of a century into the 20th century, which is why we celebrate his centenary this weekend. And he was part of a very rich environment of generations. Of course, lots could be said about this, and I'd like to elaborate on this in another context, including, of course, Wang Li, J.R. Firth, and so on, the previous generations, the subsequent generations. So Michael Halliday, same generation as Sid Lamb, Noam Chomsky, Maurice Haller, F.R. Palmer, more or less, Jürgen Habermas, so thinking out around language, but not linguistics, J.R. Quirk, Randolph Quirk. Most of them are gone. We also have the subsequent generation, including my friend Hu Zhanglin, my first professor of English linguistics, Jan Svartvik, who passed away last year, Manny Shegloff, and many others. Like a number of systemic functional linguists talking at this symposium and previous ones, I belong to about a generation after this one, so a difference about 30 years. And for me, this meant that Michael Halliday slotted in very comfortably in the same position as my half-brother Tryggve Emond. They were born in 1925, both of them. So Michael Halliday was more like a half-brother than anything else, if you think in terms of family kinship. And they passed away both in the early 90s. Now it's, of course, up to subsequent generations. And in another talk, I'd like to talk about the trajectory of this. But of course, it's time for others to contribute to this and see where we're going, because it is a collective undertaking, always conducted in dialogue. Now, it so happened, I think, that both Michael Halliday and I were kind of globe-trotting linguists, both in terms of shorter journeys to take part in symposia, conferences, workshops and so on, but also in the way we moved around the world to take up different positions. And of course, my journeys were often predicated upon his, so I followed him to Sydney, for example. And at different points in time and in space, we worked on different collaborative efforts, like the third edition of his Introduction to Functional Grammar, very much coming out of the 1980s, working on the Nigel grammar in computational linguistics text generation under the guidance by Bill Mann. Then starting in Bloomington, Indiana, and continuing for almost a decade and a half, construing experience, beginning with the Bloomington lattice in Indiana, and then continuing work on his Introduction to Functional Grammar, and various other enterprises. So if you look at my own developments, activities, you can see that all of them have been informed directly by collaborating with Michael Halliday, or indirectly by listening to him, reading him, and learning from the way he proceeded to engage with language in context, but also very much his circle of dialogue partners, like Jim Martin, for example, and obviously Ruka Hassan, Jeff Williams, many, many others over the years. And this has included the conception of multilingual studies. And I'd like to announce that we just received go-ahead, green light from Routledge with a series of multilingual studies edited by Wangbo, Helen Ma, Jorge Aruz Ita, and myself. So this is an exciting development, and I think one that is fitting to announce on the occasion of Michael's centenary. So we had various insights on the move. We, of course, usually me listening to Michael. So, for example, hiking in the Santa Monica Mountains in the early 80s, the question of how to present methods for describing languages. And we outlined a paper that would do this. We never published it, unfortunately, and I think is still something that we need, although more recently there have been very good contributions as material for how you go about describing particular languages. Walking on the campus of Laval University in 1983, the complementarity of choosers and chargers in the relationship between lexigrammar and semantics. And walking and sitting at cafes in Bloomington, the Bloomington lattice I mentioned. Walking in Manly in the early 1990s, the place of ideology along the line of instantiation, not in terms of the hierarchy of stratification in the first instance, so something that is located in terms of both semantics and context. And flying back from Tokyo to Sydney in the 90s, a discussion of Sugeno's six-pack, which turned into his nine-pack, this stratification instantiation matrix that I mentioned before. So many occasions of interacting with Michael Halliday, obviously in Sydney, but also in many other places, like the Santa Monica Mountains when he came to visit us at ISI in Los Angeles, or his time with us as a super-duper chair professor in Hong Kong in 2009. So many occasions of working and walking together in different places. And I thank Kazuhiro Toroya for taking pictures of us in different settings. They included Japan, autumn in Japan, and significantly for me, travels in England in 1986, There was a long, wonderful period of traveling around England by train, taking us, for example, to see Robin Hood Bay, where he went to school, an aunt of his in the south of England, Leeds, where he was born, and he also took me to see the church where J.B. Priestley is buried. And you all know about Michael's work on the de-automatization of grammar from Priestley's and Inspector Cause. And I've tried to pick up on that, as I have with many other of his texts that he has engaged with. So in terms of collaboration, research, writing and teaching, there have been many opportunities that I've gratefully learned from. Projects from the 1980s included the Penman project led by Bill Mann at the Information Science Institute, then translation of his Computing Meanings, working together with Sandow and Kazuhiro Teruya. First 5 years of the 21st century, the Riken Institute Brain Science Division, work led by Michio Sugeno. At PolyU, we worked on the language of abstract space. We've taught together on a number of occasions, and I learned a lot from that. And publications, I mentioned ones that have been published, and there are also a number in the pipeline that remain for me to complete. So 2 volumes of Outline of Systemic Functional Linguistics, an Introduction to English Discourse, Games with Grammar and Fun with Phonology, and a book on global and local languages. So they're all in manuscript form, different degrees of completion, and they're very much on my agenda after finishing the 5th edition of Halliday's Introduction to Functional Grammar. So I hope the outline will be a useful contribution. We started it, of course, when there are very few introductions to SFL. We now have a very rich spectrum of introductions, catering to readers from different backgrounds. But I hope that this will still be relevant when it appears. Often he would draft things, his contributions, in longhand, and then he would type them up or read them to me or give them to me to type up. Now, in conclusion, just say something about the Hallidayan potential. So let me return to Halliday's notion of how big. And I'd just like to now give this a different legend. Hallidayan potential is vast and, very importantly, is collective. So in my view, there is no such thing as post-Hallidayan SFL. It's all Hallidayan, it's Hallidayan all the way, and it's always been in dialogue with other people. It's always been collective. Let me say something about the Hallidayan potential in terms of field, tenor, mode. I think in terms of field, we can point to his significance as a generalist, and that included thinking as a grammarian, a corpus imparted innovation, but also butterfly collection, always observing language. And I noticed this when on our various walks, trips together. So here's something he picked up, for example, from a headline, Day Trip Boy Car Theft Fury. Day Trip Boy Car Theft Fury. So he was always observing in notebooks, and I tried to emulate this using modern apps like Evernote. The holistic and comprehensive approach. So he was a systems thinker. That included fractals, concurrences, for example, syndromes, and complementarities, and fractals again. Helical thinking, so returning to the same place, but not in a circle, always in the context of new experiences, new knowledge, new data, new insights coming from others. And he was very widely read, history, anthropology, neuroscience, physics, though he wasn't addicted to philosophy. And we discussed this because I'd been enamored with philosophy since high school and I studied at university. And he said, well, he felt it wasn't really about anything. And I think we can say why if we look, for example, at Lakoff and Johnson philosophy in the flesh, because so much, at least of Western philosophy, has been working out the implications of what's there in the everyday language, including the folk theories of what life is like. Tenor. So he was dialogic, he was diplomatic, He was collaborative, he was collective, he was consultative, he was congenial. So you can see him in conversation with so many people over time. Top left with Elke Teich, as you can see, very intense. With Cecilia Colombi on another occasion, it was 2015. Engaging with West Coast functionalists, Sandy Thompson, Jack Dubois, in the southwestern corner. And meeting on various occasions with Michio Sugeno and his team, first at Tokyo Institute of Technology and then at the Brain Science Division of the Riken University. And mode, well, I'll just refer again to my own experience. When we'd work together, sometimes he would dictate without having drafted anything. Often he would produce something in longhand and then dictate to me. And if we'd been working together over a day, as we frequently did at my place, one of my pleasures was precisely at the end of the day to sit down at my computer and type up what he dictated me. Or he would take it home and type it up himself and then give it to me. So this is how, for example, construing experience gradually emerged, composed in these different modes. And I would say anything he wrote, try reading his work aloud, because he had a very good sense of how you write something so that it's accessible, and that means reading it aloud. You can assign information structure. I can't guarantee that I preserve that in the subsequent editions of MHYG, though I will try. What about Michael's conception of himself? Well, on one occasion he said to me, "I'm a nibbler," and that tended to be our working days together. We'd always have a tea break in the morning with some cake, then lunch, not too heavy, but organized around dessert. Either I'd prepare it or we go out to a local eatery. And then afternoon tea was also obligatory. And then maybe a beer before or after dictation in the late day. And he said on another occasion, he said, "I must be in lizard." And I said, "Why?" Well, he said, "Because like lizards, I don't think I'm warm-blooded. I need to be in the sun to feel warm." So he was a nibbler, but he certainly loved to nibble on desserts. And I said we walked around in on many places. He certainly had articulate dislikes, and they included air conditioning and ice cream. And you may find a common denominator here. And fairly late in his life, I said, "Well, you don't like ice cream?" Well, he said, "Well, I don't know." I was surprised. I said, "But it's too cold." He said, No, as long as the ice cream is melted, I'd be happy to try it." He thought French pastry was overrated as opposed to Yorkshire cakes. McDonald's, never tried it. Supermarket, opposed to them, much preferring neighborhood shops. Singapore Airlines, overrated. Opera, Western, no good. As opposed to Peking opera, very good. And the reason for that had to do, of course, I would expect from a linguist, the voice differences in voice quality. And he was very wary of M&Ms, morons and menaces, but he had a place for fellow travelers. What was his ideal environment? Well, he said WWW, warm, wet and windy. And Rukai was there and he said how about another W, Wi-Fi as well. He had a number of principles. If you don't like something, try it again every 3 years. Your taste may have changed. It's a serious crime to drink Guinness cold, and the same applies to English ale. If you claim that English food is not good, you've overlooked Yorkshire. Avoid local specialties. They're likely to be very strange. Avoid stepping on people's toes. Some have very long toes. And I've used these principles just to give you a sense of my impression of walking and working with Michael, meaning and meandering with Michael. And this last note about steep people's toes, I think, leads us to mind how you go. Walk carefully and wish people well. Many thanks. I look forward to future occasions engaging with you in person and also virtually. Have a wonderful weekend symposium.